Hello everybody. Today we're going to be taking a look at the second discussion on the Incoherence of the Philosophers by Al-Ghazali, on refuting their statement on the post-eternity of the world, time, and motion. So, just like the last video, in this one, Al-Ghazali has a specific proposition or doctrine which he wishes to refute, and today the doctrine is: the world will exist for an eternal future despite any wish of God to annihilate it. So, essentially, the doctrine says that God has no power to destroy or annihilate the world if he so wishes. So first, there is a note that many of the arguments used to prove this are arguments that are used to prove the eternity of the past. And because they mirror those arguments, the responses will be mirrored. So if you run into one of these arguments, then you should simply run the counter, which was given in the first discussion. One interesting argument that he notes is that of the rotation of the planets, which runs like this. If Pluto and the Sun, for an eternal amount of time, both revolve around the Earth in the future, then they both revolve around the Earth the same number of times. However, Pluto is revolving faster around the Earth than the Sun is, so there is a different number. So they both have the same and different number of revolutions around the Earth. Therefore, an eternal future is impossible. Now, this is a bit different, but Al-Ghazali wants there to be a possible eternal future, but not a necessary eternal future. So what he's going to say here is that this argument against the future history of the universe is not actually impeded by this argument, because the future history of the universe only talks about things that could be. There's an infinite number of possible rotations around the Earth, but there will never be an infinite number of actual rotations around the Earth. The reason for this is that the future doesn't actually exist, and it doesn't exist all at once, and it never infinitely exists successively. So at each moment of time, there's only a finite number of things which have existed successively in the history of the universe. Now for the new arguments. The first proof, that of the sun. It's a little goofy, but, he adds it, so I add it. If the sun was susceptible to annihilation, if it was capable of being destroyed, then we would have observed it withering at some point in the last few thousand years. It has been observed as constant. Therefore, it is not susceptible to annihilation. There are many responses to this. The first is to reject premise one. Maybe it will wither quickly. Maybe we don't need to witness it. Or maybe it isn't necessary for everything that will be corrupted to wither first. Maybe it will just stop existing. There's no reason the sun has to wither before it dies completely. And then premise two, if you wanted to reject premise two, you could just say that our knowledge of the sun's size is only approximate, so it could be withering just very slowly. And Ghazali notes that the reason he adds this is to help anyone refute arguments of a similar type, which he will not include here. Then we have the second proof, which is much more interesting. There's two versions of it. This is the first version. If the world went from existing to not existing, it would necessarily have a cause. The only possible cause of this is God's will. If God willed the world to be annihilated after it existed, then there would be a change in God. There is no change in God. Therefore, the world cannot go from existing to not existing. Then there's the second argument, which Ghazali takes to be more serious, and that is, if God can annihilate the world, then he can take an action of nothingness. Such an action is impossible, therefore God cannot annihilate the world. So the idea here is that if God was to create an action, or take an action, where he brought everything into nothingness, where he destroyed everything, then that nothingness would have some kind of created property. He would have to create nothingness, but you can't create a nothing. A nothing can't be created, so it's impossible for God to annihilate the world. Ghazali catalogs 4 types of responses to this reply. I don't know how to say any of these. The Mutazila response is that God creates an annihilation. There's a thing called an annihilation, which destroys the world and then self-destructs, so as not to require its own annihilation. There's the world, and then God creates an annihilation, which destroys the world, and the annihilation dies. Okay, there are 2 responses to this. The first is that annihilations aren't things. That's dumb. And the second is that it's arbitrary to say that the annihilation does not require its own annihilation, and thus there would be an infinite regress of annihilations, and time would never end as a result of that. Then there's the Karamiya response, which is that annihilation is a being God creates in his own essence, which annihilates the world, which is also in his own essence. Ghazali points out pantheism is false, and that the world is not something which is received in God's essence, and also the annihilation would still be a created thing the same way it was on the Mutazila view, and he thinks that's dumb. Then there are 2 species of reply from the Asherites. The first one says that substances, insofar as they exist, only endure in virtue of a created endurance, which is something which is added to the substances. They endure, they're recreated at each moment. If God does not create additional endurance, then the substance falls into nothing, and its accidents would follow suit. If the substance falls into nothing, then so do the accidents. The issue Ghazali has with this is that the recreation of the world at every instant creates an infinite number of distinct beings rather than beings which are the same. So think of a book. You have the book next to you, the book is on your bedside stand, you go to sleep, you wake up, it's the same book. However, if God recreated the world at every instant at which it exists, then it's actually a different book at each instant, which seems to Ghazali insane. And I agree, that would probably be insane, and nothing would ever actually endure in existence. And also, Ghazali notes that the endurance would require its own created endurance, which would keep it in existence, which would necessitate an infinite regress of endurances. The second Asherite response is that annihilation refers to God refraining from creating motion or rest in being. And since there's no third state other than motion and rest, then being will cease. Things will just stop existing. Ghazali refers back to the earlier response about God not being able to recreate things continuously over and over and over again, because that would contradict our experience of things having this continuity in existence. Then the Aristotelian has his response. Teehee, you just refuted all of the options, and now you must admit the post-eternity of the world without the possibility of annihilation. That's just kind of how he writes it. Anyway, then Ghazali responds. Ghazali says, we could defend each of these 4 views, but instead we'll do our own thing. Non-existence proceeds from God in the same way created things proceed from God. God has this non-existence which comes from him. The Aristotelian says non-existence isn't a thing, so it can't proceed from God. Now, Ghazali takes kind of a step back and he says, okay, well, when we say non-existence proceeds from God, we don't mean non-existence is like this object which is created by God. We just mean that there's like this relationship of non-existence to God's power. So God has the power to do whatever he wishes, and so if non-existence is present, if something fails to exist, it's because God wished it to fail to exist. So in this way, non-existence isn't a created thing, but it still has a relationship to God's power because God could destroy the non-existence by creating the thing which previously failed to exist. The Aristotelian says to this that only things which are capable of annihilation by their opposites are capable of annihilation. So when you think of the color white, its opposite, hypothetically, is the color black. White would be the presence of every color on the spectrum, and black would be the presence of none of those colors. So what's happening here is that things which are capable of not existing are these objects which are capable of being replaced by a contrary. Ghazali notes, finally, that not even the Aristotelian accepts this, for motion and rest, so motion and the lack of motion, is not a case of annihilation towards an opposite. For rest is not the opposite of motion, it's simply the lack of motion. In the case of color, of whiteness and blackness, the blackness and the whiteness are both their own positive kind of entity, which are incompatible with each other. However, motion and rest have this different relationship where motion is a positive thing and rest is kind of this lack of the positive thing, at least on the Aristotelian point of view that he is contending with. So he says that even the Aristotelian does not believe this principle. As such, I'm justified in believing that God is capable of allowing things to fall into nothingness. I hope you learned something.